Hi, I'm Anna Rose Johnson, and I'm the author of The Luminous Life of Lucy Landry, which is a historical middle grade novel releasing from Holiday House on March 5th. And I'm excited today to be able to read the beginning of the first chapter for you. So let's begin. Chapter 1, Lucy's Future. Greenvale, Michigan, 1912. What are we going to do with young Lucy? These words met Lucy's ears as she sat on the stairway, listening fiercely to every sentence emanating from the parlor below. It was kind Mrs. Jones who said it, with concern in her voice. "'Tis a miserable thing, very miserable indeed," said Mrs. Pamley, whose husband was a bank manager and who was, according to the late Miss Mamie, nouveau riche. Lucy did not know what nouveau riche meant, but it resulted in Mrs. Pamley wearing ostrich-feathered hats and slim silk dresses. "Of course, we must make sure she goes to live with the right people," said Mrs. Jones. Lucy rubbed her cheek against her dear little stuffed bear, whom she had long ago christened the Meadowlark. She had named the Meadowlark after a ship of her father's, and was too stubborn to change it, even now that she was 11 years old and understood that it wasn't a proper name for a bear. This stubbornness, or rather tenacity, as Miss Mamie used to call it, was what made Lucy sit on the stairs eavesdropping, instead of staying in her room like a good girl. "Well, I'm certain Mamie must have made provisions for the child," remarked Mrs. Pamley. "Even though she did not have a great deal of money, I know she left a little something, and I imagine that when her will is read, her wishes will come to light." Lucy traced her fingers along the elegant design of the stair carpet, struggling to gather her bravery. She had lived with Miss Mamie for so long. Of course Miss Mamie had made plans for her. She thought of all the times they'd sat on the striped sofa in the parlor, putting finishing touches on herbariums and scrapbooks and admiring the Parisian fashions in vogue. Miss Mamie had a weakness for fine feathers. Surely with all the time Miss Mamie had for magazines and cut and paste, she'd had time to write something down. "I would like Lucy to live with the Jones family when I'm gone to the blue beyond." Blue beyond was Lucy's name for heaven. She much preferred it to any other name because it sounded like people were off sailing on a distant, beautiful sea. The tears were coming back. She thought she'd quenched them for good, but here they were again. The scene from 2 days earlier kept coming back into her mind, replaying itself, that moment when Sarah the housekeeper had told her the news. It had been late at night, but Lucy was still awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for word from the hospital. When Sarah had opened the door, a little bit of light had beckoned from the hallway. "I'm afraid," Sarah's voice had grown unsteady as she patted Lucy's head, "I'm afraid Miss Mamie is gone. Gone. Gone to the blue beyond." "Now, dear, I don't want you fretting, for there's no changing it." Sarah had put her slender arm around Lucy's shoulders. "Miss Mamie was a good woman, God rest her soul, and we'll miss her. But try to sleep for her sake, knowing she'd want you to have your rest." But Lucy had felt that somehow it would be intensely disloyal to sleep after that announcement. How could she? Miss Mamie had taken care of her for years. When she was a small girl, barely old enough to remember, her mother had grown ill, and Miss Mamie, a pillar in their church, took it upon herself to nurse Mama back to health. She did the best she could, but Mama had passed away, leaving Lucy and her grieving father alone. Alone except for Miss Mamie. The generous lady had offered to continue caring for Lucy while Papa, a sailor, worked on the Great Lakes, and Papa had agreed. Those had been lovely years, Miss Mamie caring for her, and Papa visiting whenever he could. Now there was no one left in the world who loved her. Of course, Sarah liked her well enough, but "Why does everyone I love have to go away?" Lucy demanded fiercely of no one in particular, scrubbing at her suddenly damp eyes. She tried to stop thinking about Miss Mamie and all the wonderful times they'd had together, singing around the piano and deciphering recipes in old cookbooks and preparing for Papa's visits, but the memories kept coming back, making her throat ache. "Oh dear, I'm late," called a familiar voice, breaking through Lucy's remembrances. The front door rattled in agitation, and Lucy knew that Miss Tempest had arrived. She liked Miss Tempest, a bicycle-riding young woman who always seemed to be breathless and busy. Like Mrs. Jones and Mrs. Pamley, Miss Tempest had been one of Miss Mamie's dear friends and had helped arrange Miss Mamie's funeral, which had taken place yesterday. The entire time Lucy had kept her face buried in Miss Tempest's skirt, and she hadn't even seemed to mind. "I heard that you were all going to have a conclave here, so I rushed over," Miss Tempest continued. "You see, Mamie mentioned to me where she wanted Lucy to live." At last, somebody with concrete information. Lucy leaned forward anxiously, squashing the meadowlark in her suddenly perspiring palms. He took it the way a good bear would. "Indeed," said Mrs. Pamley. "Please enlighten us, then." Lucy crept a little farther down the stairs, balancing against the wall and nearly knocking a picture of Miss Mamie's great-uncle off its perch. "Well," said Miss Tempest, struggling to get a good full breath after all her peddling. "It seems that when Mamie was living with her sister, she made the acquaintance of an old ship captain and his family. Mamie took a fancy to them, and they to her, and they invited her for supper quite often. The captain and his wife had several grown-up children, and one of them, a son, keeps a lighthouse somewhere on the Keweenaw Peninsula. Mamie said that if her health worsened, she dearly wanted Lucy to live with the Martins. It seems the lighthouse-keeper has quite a bushel of children, 6 or so, and she thought it would be a good place for Selina Lucy." A good place for Selina Lucy! Lucy felt as if she had tumbled down the stairs and fallen on her head. A lighthouse-keeper indeed. "Oh, well, if that's what she wanted," said Miss Pamley in a gracious yet dismissive tone. "I'm only pleased that I don't have to take in the child. I was afraid it would come to that." Lucy folded her arms and pretended she was an elegant queen sitting on her throne, listening to the pathetic whims of a visiting peasant. "Of course you cannot take in the child," said Lucy the queen. "She's far too spirited for the likes of the nouveau riche." Now she imagined Mrs. Pamley the peasant looking ashamed of herself and curtsying humbly. "I am deeply sorry, Your Majesty," she would say, and the palace guards would escort her out. Lucy brushed the tears out of her eyes. "Mamie's will is to be read tomorrow when the lawyer arrives," said Mrs. Jones. "We'll know the definitive answer then. But I suppose one of us ought to be prepared to contact this Martin family. Would it be possible to find their address among Mamie's things?" "The will ought to include the address and other things, I should think," said Mrs. Pamley. Mrs. Jones disagreed. "Not necessarily. Sarah, will you take charge of looking for any information about the Martins?" "I suppose I can," Sarah replied, none too enthusiastically. Sarah had been Miss Mamie's housekeeper for years, at least since Lucy came to live there, and she was in charge of the house now that Miss Mamie was gone. Of course, Mrs. Jones and Mrs. Pamley and Miss Tempest were more or less behaving as if they were the ones in charge, but Sarah seemed unbothered by their bossiness. Perhaps she was too accustomed to bossiness to mind very much. The ladies left not long after. Lucy crept down the final few steps and slipped into the parlour, taking care to smooth her dress free of wrinkles first. She had always loved Miss Mamie's parlour, with its crushed velvet settee, beloved striped sofa, paintings of long-ago people, and carpet with a stain where Lucy had accidentally dropped a jar of honey while pretending to be a honeybee. She was too old to pretend she was a honeybee any more. Now she was a lady, or queen, or princess. Lucy spread her skirts and sat on the settee most delicately. She would simply have to explain to Sarah and Miss Tempest and all the rest that a lighthouse was no place for someone like Lucy. The situation was quite impossible. And that's the beginning of Chapter 1. I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope that you will pick up a copy of The Luminous Life of Lucy Landry. Thank you so much.